the news dropped about a month or so back, the Jedi Survivor was indeed getting a last generation release. It pointed towards a big and much needed patch incoming for current generation and PC to fix many of the issues we covered in our launch review. Well, endure no more as the results are in. Is this a new hope or the last of the Jedi?
A Jedi.
Now at launch, the current gen had dual modes, by the side the Series S, and a solid and impressive visual quality, specifically in that quality mode. The performance mode, although welcome, had far too many problems, not least of which was the image quality and indeed its performance. The mode was not ready for prime time. It still ran pretty much the same as quality with ray trace reflections and global illumination, which although it varied from scene and coverage, it did improve areas with better self-shading, some light bounce and more physically accurate reflections. You can see here in comparisons with the new patch performance mode on the right versus launch day code on the left, with the irradiance bounce from the neons hitting the pots and metal. With the latest patch, the RTGI and AO pass is removed and is now using a mix of dynamic lights and SSAO, removing this bounce lighting and creating some light leakage, as you can see from the metal pipes behind the sign. This still runs in the quality mode as before though. But the improved AO and resolution in the later patch means the change is a mix of pros and cons. The biggest with the old code seen here in side by sides with the previous versions 108. The old performance mode had to drop resolution very low, with a counted low of 1152 by 648 in our review at launch, targeting a 1440p-like reconstruction output. In addition, it would also tear when running below that required 16.67 millisecond frame time, and VRR did not work on either console. Although this has been added finally for the PS5 in this patch, and I think it was added prior in the Series X patches. Now even with all this, the PlayStation 5 and Series X still ran into the 40s often, and in the opening mission it was CPU bound and data streaming, and many of these issues were still present on the PC, which was the most affected by these throughout play. Roll on 4 months later and we now have what was clearly a mode they should have held back until now, achieving its name far more confidently. This big update in version 1.9 on PS5 and 1.11 on Series X and S improved both modes, but let's start with the biggest: resolution and performance. Using these side by sides, we can see the same shot in the 1.09 patched version runs at 2 times higher resolution and better frame times. In this section, the 1.08 patch hits a counted low of 648p, with the 109 patch topping out at 1706 by 960 base, back to 1440p via FSR2, effectively FSR2 quality mode at 1440p output. This is exactly what was happening as we covered in our previous review, scaling between these modes: FSR quality, balance, performance and potentially ultra performance. This means that in gameplay at least, we now see significantly sharper image quality overall and better performance, with the old average across this run being close to 762p and now often 960p, approximately 60% increase in pixel counts, and as we'll see next, a similar increase in performance. Now the launch version locked all cutscenes to 30 FPS quality, but you could jump into the menu and turn that back on, showing how incomplete that mode was at the time. Now this bypass did demonstrate that these can run okay due to that reduced resolution, largely 648 and 720p respectively on PlayStation 5 and Series X, and due to the bars the counts are actually slightly lower, but also the team's artistic aim was for that movie look, and 30 FPS hits that better with motion blur. And in this patch, the menu has changed and you can no longer change this during those real-time cutscenes, but this option was actually removed in a prior patch anyway, I believe around 1.05 or thereabouts. Now using the Series X as a test in this opening segment, we can see that it tears and dips into the low 30s here, still at 720p most often as a base. The latest patch in the quality mode seems to top out at the same 1440p high as before on both consoles, meaning this mode is not significantly different in IQ and performance, although changes have been made across the game beyond these, which I'll get to shortly.
Open fire! Get to cover!
The biggest cost of the performance mode was the use of ray tracing, which adds a great deal of work on the CPU and GPU with its increase in data throughput due to the extra geometry and samples used for the BVH objects. This includes reflections, light and ambient occlusion samples, which affected PC and consoles alike. With this new mode disabling the ray tracing completely, it means we now see some reductions in FX as covered and some improvements, but the biggest lacking area is the reduction of RT reflections and now relying on screen space reflections. On the opening Coruscant mission, the soft brush metals and diffuse reflections are not so bad. Yes, they are obvious with very low resolution masking of objects causing ghosting and silhouettes around characters, along with wiping of objects away from off-screen samples, but this was already the only mode on Series S, and although far from the best use of SSR, it works well enough here. The big issues come on planets with large pools of water, and the alpha channel issues from grass and foliage mean these now look very blocky, noisy, and really do not work. I covered this in the review version also, as the ghosting and artifacts from FX looked borderline buggy, and I hope the team would have improved these for the patch, which is not the case. As such, it is an obvious cost and one that you will have to bear for the huge boost in resolution and performance. In addition to this though, the team have increased level of detail on grass and objects, with even the new performance mode offering better LOD than the old quality mode. SSAO is now used in performance mode and even looks to be used in quality mode, which may be a screen space ray traced ambient occlusion pass, which can draw off screen when occluded. But moving from performance to quality pre and post patch, you can see the increased AO off into the distance and largely darker, more grounded shading used in this latest patch. PlayStation 5 and Series X are identical, and Series S is closest to performance mode with no ray tracing present still. We can see that when moving from performance to quality though, the BVH is built, and this means that the GI bounce is drawn in over multiple frames and fades in over a few seconds. This can cause bugs on lighting passes on both consoles, and sometimes it's best just to quit the mission, change and then reload, which resolves this. So some bugs here do remain, and even if incorrect shadows and 2D billboards can show up, overall the latest patch looks better than the older one, and the shading and lighting quality is better in both modes, with a generally more pleasing image than the old version, which can look oversaturated and washed out due to the excessive light bounce calculation, and the matte painting look here that was synonymous throughout the Star Wars movies works better in this newer patch. I myself prefer this new mode's visual look and increased IQ, but you may choose differently. I also noted that the Series X has a slight advantage on resolution counts, with some shots being around 847p on PS5 and 960p on Series X. Now these only came up in like-for-like pixel counts, but generally the Series X has a 15 to 20% advantage at best, and in others they were the same. Now this can cause some tearing and dips in those real-time cutscenes on PS5 over the Series X, but as these tend to keep pixel counts higher and similar between them, it's largely the reason why.
What y'all doing around these parts?
Looking up an old friend. Grease-dritis?
Grease? Oh shoot, I know him. I run the stables in
So
town.
with all the sacrifices and changes detailed, we now understand why we're seeing such a difference in some of the visual aspects and certainly the resolution and performance. As noted, both Series X and PlayStation 5 could dip down to the low 40s and even 30s at certain points in later sections of the game itself, and this opening section is certainly one of the most demanding on CPU and data streaming due to the amount of materials and ambient occlusion and dense objects within this level. Moving over to the latest version though, we now see a locked 60 FPS on the PlayStation 5 versus its previously version 1.08, which was only slightly better than the release and review code we covered back then. There has been some changes and some reductions in certain aspects up until this point, but this is the biggest and most significant change the team have delivered. We're seeing at worst case 51% improvement on the lows and an average of 24% on this PlayStation 5 version compared like for like, as you see here. This makes the game feel more consistent and solid across the board, and this carries over perfectly to the Series X, which is actually improved slightly more because it ran slightly worse than the PlayStation 5 at launch, which is no longer the case as they are practically identical in performance. A side margin of error, I cannot split anything between the two. Therefore, it's certainly the mode that I would recommend, and it certainly works much better now than the one we had at launch, and it was the one that was in the most need of improvement. Quality is not significantly different at all, and performance was already rock solid in that aspect, and here we can see the PlayStation 5 and Series X perform absolutely identical in gameplay sections. The Series X does carry a slight advantage in those cutscenes again, down to the fact that they hold that resolution higher. It means it tears and dips ever so slightly more on the PlayStation 5 on occasion, so you could see in the region of around 5 to 10% differences at certain points. But again, they're cutscenes, it's not always consistent, and it is within margin of error, but there definitely is that slight advantage to the Series X in this case, and that's carried over to those resolution deltas I mentioned earlier. The Series S is also now improved, and it only appears to scale down to 900p, upscale back using FSR2 to 1080p, and it was a lock solid 30 FPS. Even before this, it was pretty consistent, but it certainly could have some dips. But testing those same sections, I'm now getting no dips, a lock 30 FPS, and it doesn't appear to dynamically scale lower than 900p. But again, with all DRS solutions, that is always a caveat, it could go lower. Overall, this was the version that was the most solid of the lot due to the cutbacks, the sacrifices, and the lack of any ray tracing. But here, this is a belt and braces update that means if you haven't played on the Series S, it's still a very consistent and cracking looking title. It's certainly gained from the updates here in image quality and performance, but it's a much smaller margin than that performance mode on the bigger consoles.
Give up. Stop. Monkey clock.
In addition to this, the PC has also seen improvements with DLSS 2 now added into the main menu, which means if you have an Nvidia card, you can get improved image quality and performance without having to rely on FSR2. So overall, they've made big strides in this update, which are likely connected to that last generation version that is on its way. Some of these improvements will help that version ship on that console, but obviously there's a lot more here to be cut back to fit onto the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One. That said, it's nice to see these improvements on the performance mode and certainly some tweaks in that quality mode, and there are some nice visual updates and improvements that make the game look and perform much better than the launch version. But I wish the team had held back and not released the performance version. As I said at the time, I think it created more noise and slight on a game that was superb with its quality 30 FPS mode on consoles. The PC version, as I mentioned, had serious issues at launch, and this version now seems to perform much better. Due to limited time on this video, I haven't had time to cover a PC version in depth, but it might be something we look at a later date. As it stands, the game was always great in its quality mode, but if you haven't played it as yet or want to replay, then you now have the very best version and choice to enjoy this cracking Jedi Survivor. And that draws a close to another pixels performance and more ray trace lighting than you can shake a lightsaber at. If you enjoy what we do here on IGN Performance Reviews, then keep it IGN, and we'll catch you on the next one.
Impressive! But you're hurting bad inside, Kestis. I can sense it.